Hello students, now we will discuss the evolution of the discipline in its second part. Here we will basically discuss what are the major world events, particularly the events in Europe and America that contributed for the evolution and growth of our discipline. So, we will be proceeding like this. First, we will be talking of the major world events in international relations, particularly called as Big Bangs. Within those Big Bangs, we will be first talking of the Treaties of Westphalia, then we will be covering on the European imperialism and colonialism, then the First World War, then the Second World War, then we will shift our focus to the evolution of international relations in India, then we will be talking of the end of the Cold War, the globalization process and the major events since 2000. Ending with some important concluding points. So, let us start to our first major event that contributed for a major change in the discipline of international relations, that is what is called the Treaties of Westphalia. For some Western scholars, the field history from European state system to the present has been events driven. So, if you look at those major events, they are so great that contributed in a major way to the evolution and growth of our discipline. Contemporary state system in Europe originated in 1648 with the Treaties of Westphalia that ended the 30 years war. Particularly, it marked the emergence of secular authorities in Europe. You may have some knowledge about the medieval history where the kings and the queens ruled the territorial entities with the support of the lords who provided military support when there was a need. There was no nation state, no nationalism, no permanent army, and the Pope, who had given some kind of unity to the continent, was possessing enormous power, and that is how the kings and queens derived their authority, particularly from the Pope, who was the head of the Christian religion. The Treaty of Westphalia had certain major impacts. First, it embraced the notion of sovereignty. You must be knowing that when we say sovereignty, sovereignty refers to that supreme power of the state by virtue of which the state is internally and externally independent. So, nobody can challenge the state authority within the state. In case you challenge the state authority, then the state has enormous coercive power that it can use against you. Similarly, if anybody challenges the state authority from outside, that may result in a war. So, for the first time, the Treaty of Westphalia popularized and embraced the notion of sovereignty for the states. Second, the leaders of Europe's most powerful countries established their own permanent national militaries. As I said, there was no concept of permanent military and national military. So, the military support was given by the lords, whom we called in India as Jamindars, to those kings and queens who were ruling Europe in different kingdoms and different regions. Third, a core group of states dominated the world until the beginning of 19th century. You will find at that time the powerful countries like Austria, Russia, Prussia, England and France. So, these were the countries that took major advantage at that time and consolidated their power, and that is why there was what is called a long peace for those 100 years starting from 1819 to 1919. So, it is about 100 years. Now, let me talk about the European imperialism and colonialism. The European imperialism and colonialism reinforced Europe's hegemony in international relations for several centuries to come. Still today, we talk about Eurocentrism in international relations and how Europe and America dominated the discipline of international relations. So, this European imperialism and colonialism had a major impact on the evolution and growth of the discipline. Undoubtedly, imperialism and empires it created did havoc with the colonialized population and destroyed their societies, culture and economy. If you get a chance, you go through the famous book by Dadabhai Naoroji called Poverty and Un-British Rule in India. You would find what was the exploitative character of British imperialism in India and how that contributed for the betterment of and richness of the European continent. It also acted as a driving force behind the creation of today's global international society. You can call this at the beginning of the first era of globalization, because it linked previously isolated political communities and economies through power and conquest. Those territories and communities which were living outside Europe, they were conquered through the demonstration of naked power by the colonial countries, and that is how they integrated those political communities through their policy of imperialism and colonialism. The same process of globalization led to the dissolution of these empires in the 20th century. Once you integrated them, definitely there was a chance that everything was influenced, your way of life, your ideas, your education system, your transportation and communication. So that definitely integrated those distant communities and geographies, but it also led to the destruction of European imperialism and colonialism. European ideas about the statehood and national self-determination encouraged colonial liberation movements across the world. You know what happened after the end of the Second World War, when the process of decolonization led many countries of Africa, Asia and Latin America to get their independence, and they were integrated into the international system. So basically the ideas of statehood and national self-determination, these ideas, their education system, loyalty towards one's nation, these kind of ideas helped the colonial people to mobilize themselves against the imperial powers, and that led to the end of imperialism and colonialism, at least in a geographical sense. Then the British hegemony played a key role in maintaining the long peace in Europe from 1814 to 1914. So because the United Kingdom were the superpower at that time, so there was a continuity in its foreign policy, and that helped it to maintain at least some kind of balance of power between and among different powerful countries of Europe at that time, and that led to what we call the long peace in Europe at least for 100 years. Now let me talk about the First World War and its impact on the discipline of international relations. The rise of Germany, the imperial competition in non-European world and the advent of modern industrial technologies all cited as the causes of the First World War. So there is not a single cause, you will find so many causes, but these were all the immediate causes of the First World War. It fundamentally reshaped international affairs, ended the long peace and created an urgency in the study of international relations, leading to its institutional establishment in 1919. So when the First World War began, it in a major way it contributed for the transformation of international affairs, ended the long peace of last 100 years, and it also led to the institutional establishment of international relations as a separate discipline in the year 1919. The first chair was established at the University of Wales in 1919 and devoted to the systematic study of the causes of war and conditions for peace. So in a way you can say this was the primary objective of international relations right from its beginning, because those issues were the pressing issues at that time, and as a discipline it was devoted for studying, for understanding and analyzing what are the causes of war and how could peace be established. It was offered as a separate branch of study in many European and American universities since 1920s onwards. So you would find not just in UK, rather it became a separate discipline and studied and researched as a separate discipline in many countries in Europe, in America and in many other parts of the world. Think tanks also made a long standing contribution. Think tanks means research institutes that also played a major role, a vital role for the consolidation of the discipline. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, established in the year 1910, the Royal Institute of International Affairs in the United Kingdom, established in 1920, the Australian and the New Zealand Institute of International Affairs emerged in 1933 and 1934. So, this is how those think tanks, those research institutes, they concentrated a lot of their efforts on studying international relations, on researching on international relations, and that is how in a major way they contributed for the growth of the discipline. The interwar years were optimistic period as the League of Nations was established as a forum to manage the interstate disputes through negotiation and not war. So, this is for the first time you would find an international institution that was devoted for the cause of preventing war and establish peace. And not just the League of Nations, there was also the International Court of Justice at Hague that was also there to resolve the interstate disputes of that time. Then let us focus about the Second World War and its impact on the discipline of international relations. The Second World War started as certain states were unhappy with the interwar status quo, especially Germany and Japan. So, when the First World War concluded, there was peace plan, and that peace plan was in a way unjust for countries like Germany, and that was the major reason why Germany was unhappy, why Italy was unhappy, and there was also Japan in Asia that in a major way also contributed for the beginning of Second World War. This led to the collapse of the League of Nations and the beginning of another deadly world war. So, when this Second World War started, so the institutional framework that was there to prevent the cause of war or the onset of war, that was demolished, and the League of Nations collapsed like a play of cards, and that led to the beginning of a big world war. A group of states called the Allied Powers, presently those who are the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, they were all in that bloc that is called Allied Powers, opposed the Axis powers, ending with the occupation of Germany and the surrender of Japan. You know how the United States entered into the Second World War, used nuclear weapons against Japan twice within a span of 2-3 days, and how that led Japan to surrender. That is how the Second World War ended. It is considered as the most significant war due to its scale and devastating impact. It reinforced the realist belief that warfare was endemic to mankind's past and likely to be a central problem in our future. So, this is the period in which the idealist paradigm of international relations that was in a crisis, and this is the period when realism actually got the opportunity to consolidate itself. The post Second World War period also some other major developments that had implications for the discipline of international relations. The first was the end of the European imperial power and the beginning of decolonialization process in Asia, Africa and Latin America that led to what we call the so-called third world countries and the establishment of the NAM after a few years, and it also expanded the scope of international relations because the IR was now at least dealing with an international system that was not just Europe, but few countries from Asia, Africa and Latin America, they got their independence, and that is how the boundaries of international relations was expanded to some extent. There was also the first attempt to establish the formal organizations for global governance, leading to what you call the United Nations system and the Bretton Woods system. I called it as the first serious attempt because although the League of Nations were there and Woodrow Wilson, the former American president, played an important role for its establishment, America was not a member. So, that was one of the reasons why the League of Nations was not a success. So, this was the first time that there was an organization which was having universal membership, and this was the organization that was in a way established to contribute for the prevention of another major world or another major world war. The Second World War created structural changes in the global distribution of power, leading to what is called the domination of two superpowers and the beginning of the Cold War. After this, the end of the Cold War, there was the United States and the Soviet Union, those who emerged as leading superpowers of that time, and that the ideological rivalry between these two countries led to what we call the Cold War that continued for a long period of time. New ideological rivalry, arms race, proxy war, mutual assured destruction through the nuclear factor all became the new issues of study under the international relations. So, earlier the agenda was just to prevention of war and finding the possibility of peace. Now, because of Cold War rivalry between the two superpowers, new issues emerged for the study, and that was this kind of arms race, balance of power, proxy war, mutual assured destruction, nuclear disarmament. So many other issues captured the attention of international relations scholars, and that became the new agenda of the discipline. New dimension was also added in the form of non-state actors influencing and shaping the working of international relations. This was a minor factor because the new actors that we call the non-state actors, they were not influential, but that was the time at least there was a need, and some non-state actors emerged of course in the 50s and 60s, but they were not as influential as they are today. So, that was in any way a major development in the post Second World War period. Now, let me focus the evolution of international relations in India. Amidst the major developments in the world and Europe, serious efforts were being made to study international relations in India. So, it is not that international relations became a separate discipline in Europe and America. To some extent, the Indians particularly during the freedom struggle and during the period before India's independence, some efforts were made to study the discipline, but in a different way. Institutionalization started with the Indian Council of World Affairs, which is considered as India's first independent international affairs think tank in 1943. Just see, in the year 1943, there was a need and there was an urgency to study and research on the discipline of international relations. The ICW publishes a prestigious research journal called India Quarterly, and this journal started publishing since 1945. It was followed by the Indian School of International Studies, which began at Delhi University in 1955, and in subsequent years it moved to Jawaharlal Nehru University in 1970, and it was named as the School of International Studies. The SIS publishes a peer-reviewed journal called International Studies. The International Relations Department in Jadavpur University was established in the year 1956 and considered as the first bona fide distinct university department. It also publishes a prestigious research journal called Jadavpur Journal of International Relations. After the JNU and the Jadavpur University experiment, many other premier universities were offering masters and PhD programs in international relations, area studies and peace and conflict studies. Some of them include the Delhi University, the Jamia Millia Islamia University, the Pondicherry University, Aligarh Muslim University, Mahatma Gandhi University, South Asia University, Ashoka University, Jindal University, Shiv Nadar University, Christ University and many other central universities established during the last 2 decades. The institutional foundation was further strengthened by rapid mushrooming of both governmental and non-governmental research institutes and think tanks like the Institute for Defence Studies and Analysis, the Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies, the Center for Air Power Studies, the Center for Land Warfare Studies, the Institute for Chinese Studies, the Center for Policy Research, the Foreign Policy Research Center, the Observer Research Foundation, the Delhi Policy Group, the Gateway House and many others both in the national capital and in other parts of the country. They conduct significant research on Indian international relations, but play a very small role in the process of teaching of international relations in Indian universities and colleges. So, that is how the discipline of international relations emerged in India. Let me now shift our focus to the next Big Bang event, that is called the end of the Cold War. The end of the Cold War had major effects that we still feel in international relations. It left the United States as the only superpower because of the disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1991, leading to what the US international relations scholars called the unipolar moment. This introduced a new set of dangers and opportunities into international society. You must remember the 1991 Gulf crisis, and that was in a way caused because of the US hegemony in international relations, and after 2 years there was a collapse of Soviet Union. Various global changes generated anomalies between existing theories and world developments. Particularly, you will find that the failure to predict the collapse of the Soviet Union was highly damaging for the realists who dominated throughout the period of Cold War. This led to renewal interest in alternative IR theories such as feminism, critical theory, postmodern theory and many other theories. So, basically you will find that it reduced the importance of the mainstream theories, and that is the reason why there was a lot of alternative theories challenging the monopoly and hegemony of the mainstream theories. Although the critical theories in a way explain the changes in international relations, but they also failed to provide a comprehensive theory of change. So, that is why they are also criticized. They rejected the possibility of a grand theoretical synthesis, but accused of causing fragmentation of international relations and leading to a movement towards what James N. Rosenu says, a movement towards post-international politics. Now, basically when Rosenu is saying about post-international politics, he meant to say that nowadays there is no agreement on many issues in international relations, unlike the realist tradition or the liberal tradition, and we also do not know where we are actually going through these major changes. So, that is the reason why he used this term post-international politics. It greatly also weakened NAM, the non-aligned movement, defying its Cold War logic. The NAM was established in the beginning of the Cold War when the two superpowers tried to bring the newly independent countries of Asia, Africa and Latin America into their military camp, but they refused because of their own priorities and concerns, and that is how it was established in the year 1961 in Belgrade and called the non-aligned movement. It also led to the establishment of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and hope for reforming the United Nations and expansion of the European Union and NATO. So, this is the period the United Nations was in a way paralyzed due to the frequent use of veto powers by both the superpowers, and when the Cold War ended, when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a hope that the United Nations could play an important role in international politics because of the absence of the Soviet Union, and that is the reason why there was a lot of debate and discussion for reforming the United Nations system, especially its most powerful organ, the Security Council. Now, let me focus on another major world event, that is called globalization. The whole concept of globalization is highly contested and even debated, but it is widely understood as the widening, deepening and speeding of the global interconnectedness facilitated by the information technology revolution. So, basically it is the information technology revolution and the structural adjustment program, different countries of Africa, Asia and Latin America, that contributed for the integration of the world, for the interconnectedness of the world. Thomas Friedman identifies three areas of globalization, driven first by the states, then by the companies, and finally by the individuals. Globalization driven by the US hegemony in international relations. If the process of globalization started in the third phase, what we can say, it is because of the US hegemony in international relations, allowing it to establish liberal democracy and economy are the world's preferred political and economic ideologies. If you need to expand the ideology, if you need to popularize any ideology in international politics, you need the backing of a major power or a superpower. So, that is how the process of globalization was popularized. It was implemented in many countries of the world through the structural adjustment program and many other economic and non-economic reforms, and to establish and penetrate the process of globalization. Liberal ideology institutionalized through international organizations like the establishment of the World Trade Organizations, the World Bank and the IMF. Though the World Bank and the IMF were established after the Second World War under the Bretton Woods system, the World Trade Organization was established in the early 1990s, and that in a way contributed for the penetration of economic ideas suitable for globalization. The another process can be called as the democratization process, which became a key element of US foreign policy at that time. It basically sought to extend the zone of democratic peace supported by the democratic peace theory. The process of democratization or democracy as an element of US foreign policy became popular in those days, and this was the reason why the United States attacked countries like Afghanistan and Iraq to establish democracy in those countries, because there was a perception that less democracy leads to more violence and terrorism. So, that was the reason why it became an important element of US foreign policy. The globalization critics point out that the states remain the key actors in international society, setting the rules by which globalization continues to unfold. So, there was a lot of debate in the globalization process that whether it has affected the state's authority, the state's sovereignty, whether people were talking of the borderless world. So, those who basically criticized the globalization process, they argued that the state facilitated the globalization process. They were not eclipsed, or they did not lose their authority because of globalization. Still they are the primary actors, and although there are other actors in international politics, states are the primary actors. So, that was basically the perception. Its supporters point to non-state actors as an influential category in international politics, and also the key beneficiary, connecting the previously isolated groups and potentially creating a global civil society. So, the whole concept of international civil society or global society came in early 1990s, particularly after this globalization, economic liberalization and the information technology revolution, and you now feel how the world is connected, how the world is deeply integrated, and if there is anything happens in New York Stock Exchange, you feel its impact in the Bombay Stock Exchange. If there is any problem in India, you feel its impact in Europe. If there is any problem in Europe, the impact is felt all over the world. So, that is how we are now deeply integrated that anything can be felt in any other parts of the world, and that is how the globalization process facilitated the integration of the whole world. It has the potential to disrupt international society by allowing people, goods and ideas to cross borders more easily, threatening sovereignty of the state. So, when there is globalization, that naturally helps and allows the people to move from this part of the world to that part of the world. Not just the people, goods and ideas also cross different countries, and that is how in a way that has affected the state sovereignty. The 9/11 terrorist attack, the 2008 global financial crisis, the COVID, the Russia-Ukraine war are some of the few examples that went global thanks to the changes brought out by the process of globalization. So, if there is Russia-Ukraine war, the whole world is getting affected. If there was COVID, the whole world was paralyzed. So, that is the impact of globalization, that if something happened in China, if something happened in Wuhan, you felt the impact, and you not only felt the impact in your country, rather you remember what happened during the COVID years. So, that is how the process of globalization has affected all of us. It not only just integrated different economies, it not only just brought technology, advanced communication, encourage the people, ideas and goods and services to move from different countries to other parts of the world. Rather, it also made us highly dependent and also vulnerable at the same time. Now, let me focus on some major events since 2000. During the last few years, the world witnessed an era of globalization and deglobalization. Just remember when President Donald Trump was there, how he made this famous statement, America first. So, that explains the deglobalization process. The rise of big tech companies challenging the authority of the states. There was a lot of controversy between Google and the Australian state, and the Google and many states in Europe, particularly about the power of the state to control these big tech companies, right. And then there was the costly US imperial adventure in Afghanistan and Iraq, the rise of India and China, and the discussion about in the Asian century, the 2008 and 9 economic crisis, the decline of US power, particularly its superpower status, having major implications on the units, processes and structure of international system and its main theories and concepts. So, these are some of the major events that are in a way substantially affected the way we did research, the way we theorized on many important events, and the way we understood the concepts. A variety of global issues and threats like environmental crisis, the danger of additional nuclear weapon states, the turmoil across parts of Africa and Asia, international terrorism, China's Belt and Road Initiative, the outbreak of COVID and the USA-China trade war, Russia-Ukraine war, economic recession in many advanced countries such as in Japan, in Germany and to some extent in USA and now in China. So, these are the events that had significant effects on the structure of the international system and in their practical political implications. So, these events in a way contributed for major changes in international relations. At the same time, there is a general inability of international institutions to deal with those challenges, raising a question mark on their effectiveness and legitimacy. You will find this in the frustrations of many countries including India, Japan and many other countries when we discuss about the expansion of the UN Security Council, and although there was a lot of efforts, there was a lot of hope for the reform of the United Nations Security Council, and still the matter is still not resolved, and these countries are feeling frustrated, they are feeling neglected, and that is the reason why the whole concept of international relations, the whole concept of international organizations, that has come to a question mark. Now, let us end our discussion with some important points. The first point is the disciplinary history provides interesting insights for understanding how the field attempted to establish its identity. So, we have seen how different traditions of thought, how the major events in Europe and America, they contributed for the evolution and the growth of the discipline to establish its own independent identity. But there are many issues when we look at the disciplinary growth. There is no consensus on the essential dimensions of the field's evolution. Some are saying big events are responsible, some are saying different traditions are responsible, some are saying great debates are responsible, some are saying those events only focus on Europe and America, not the global south. So, there is no unanimity on the essential dimensions of the field's evolution. There is also a concern about the little or no attention to methodological issues, particularly when I am talking of methodological issues, many of the methods used in international relations. They are based on the Western experience, the Western culture, Western history. It does not say anything, it does not study the experience and ideas from the global south. So, there are methodological errors and methodological problems when we try to understand the history of international relations. The dynamics of disciplinary formation can tell us a lot or even hide us a lot. I can give you the example of the role of marginalized and excluded voices, including those of women. So, nobody knows what are the role of the marginalized people in the growth of the discipline, in the history of the discipline. And although we know something about them through the study of feminism, particularly it was originated and popularized only in the Second World War and especially in 1990s. Want to know about the history of the international relations discipline in a much systematic way or in a more better way, then that does not help us to understand the role of many marginalized people. Then there are issues of race and empire missing from mainstream theories. We make a lot of claim that realism best explains the working of international relations, or there is an alternative mega theory called liberalism, but this liberalism and realism, they may be big theories, they may be popularized in the discipline of international relations, but they do not explain and analyze important issues that affect us, particularly the issues of race and empire. Each of the two ways has its own merits, and when applied combinedly, they hold the promise of confirming what John Gunnels pointed out, that truth is very often more convincing than fiction, and it carries as much critical force. So, the point is there are different traditions of thought through which we can understand international relations. There are big events, but it would be better if you combine both the approaches. That will give us some idea about the disciplinary history of international relations. These complexities and uncertainties make the study of international relations so interesting, fascinating and useful today. So, as we discussed, the discipline has undergone several changes. It was influenced by major events. There was different kinds of tradition. So, if you combine all these events, all these changes, all these debates, so combiningly together, they help us to have a better understanding of the growth of the discipline what we describe as international relations. So, thank you very much for your patient hearing. Thank you.